Okay.
Okay, in the few minutes we have together before she comes back with the police, we better get down to it. So my name's Don Moore. Thanks for the overly generous introduction, Greg. Let's see. I was an undergraduate psychology major, and then when I finished college, went to go work for a corporation in the Chicago suburbs, where I hated what they wanted me to do. I was a buyer in charge of magnets, thermometers, machine mounting and leveling, fabrics, cork, and felt. Anyway, that was dreadful. But I was fascinated by the circumstances surrounding my work. In particular, I was fascinated by how the company selected people, both to hire and to promote, how communication flowed within the company, how employees got evaluated. I hope that this doesn't describe any of the organizations with which you're familiar, but at this company, which shall remain nameless, big decisions often came down on a Friday, and when you got called into a conference room, you knew something important was going to happen, but most of the time people had no idea if they were going to be fired or promoted. That suggests a failure of communication within the organization. And so when I went back to grad school, I thought I wanted to study selection decisions and interviews, and found out very quickly that it was a lousy research topic. Why? Because it has been studied to death. We have the answers. The answers are very well established. Decades of research on selection tools have produced really clear results. The stunning part of that investigation for me was how completely we in academia have failed to transmit that message in a way that has produced uptake within the business world. So most companies continue to use terrible systems for selecting people and often lack the tools for figuring out that their selection systems are terrible. And so we're stuck in this lousy situation where the information that's been known in academia for decades isn't getting out into the world to influence the things that should be changing. And so it makes a great research topic, which makes me very happy to be with you here today. Let's see, what else should I say about me? So I fled this industrial supply company and went back and got my PhD at the Kellogg School at Northwestern, and have been studying decision making. Now I don't study selection decisions. I study overconfidence in selection decisions and lots of other domains. But I love teaching about this topic. What else should I say by way of introduction? I have 2 kids. I live in Berkeley. I'm a Sagittarius. Okay. What I'm hoping that I'll get to talk to you about today includes using interviews to predict performance. Here we'll have to confront some of the shortcomings of interviews. Trying to get a better handle on computing the value of selection. I'll talk about biases in the selection process. Not just interviews, but also promotion decisions and supervisor evaluations, and then try to talk a little bit about the implications. Most of these implications will be pretty obvious based on what I've talked about already, but we'll focus specifically on tools for doing better. By the end of my presentation today, I hope I will have shown you some of the evidence suggesting that selection is hard, that understanding what skills make someone successful at the job you're filling is essential for designing a good selection process. That may seem obvious, but as soon as I articulate it this simply and clearly, you will realize the way that your company does selection is not driven by evidence on what actually leads people to be successful. It's driven by whoever, the naive theories of whoever is making the decision, making the promotion or the hiring decision, and their beliefs about what makes someone successful in the absence of evidence, usually. If you can figure out what actually makes someone successful, what you're selecting for, you want to figure out how to assess those skills. Not always easy. Most of us have an abiding faith in the quality of our own judgment to assess others' characters. The evidence suggests it's harder than most of us think it is. One of the tools that most of us think is useful and will probably continue to use, despite its imperfections, as interviews. I'll give you some tips on how to make them better. A key concept that we're going to be using throughout the next hour and a half, so me and Ming, is the concept of correlation. So you know enough analytics to understand what a correlation is. Correlations vary between -1 and 1, where a perfect negative relationship would be a diagonal line like that. This represents a perfect positive relationship, a correlation of 1. So if we measured all of your heights in this room and then measured your heights tomorrow, those should correlate with each other about 1. Unless something really weird happens. This is what a correlation of 0.9 looks like. The correlation between someone's height and their arm span. That's about 0.9. It's a very strong correlation. This is what a correlation of 0.8 looks like. That's a correlation of 0.7. 0.6 correlation is still stronger than just about anything that we're going to see in HR and personnel selection. Correlation of 0.5. This is the correlation between how someone performs on a job and how they perform on the same job the next year. That's important. It's actually 0.54. It's a little better than this.
Quartering or ordinal or?
Yes. Yep. So if 0.54 is the correlation between how someone does on the job 1 year and the same job, same person, same job next year, you aren't going to get any selection method that does better than that. That is the ceiling that we should aspire to get close to. But that leaves about 2/3 of the variance unaccounted for. You know how someone performed on the job 1 year? How are they going to perform next year? Remains a profound mystery. So this is a hard problem, and we should have moderate expectations about our ability to make perfect forecasts. None of the forecasts are going to be perfect. They'll all have error in them. Job performance is profoundly unpredictable for interesting and complicated reasons that we'll get into. This is what a correlation of 0.4 looks like. Height and weight are correlated with each other about 0.4. So this is a real relationship. It is statistically significant, even in modest sample sizes. But knowing how tall someone is should not leave you very confident about estimating their weight. There are plenty of tall, skinny people and short, heavy people, and knowing one shouldn't allow you to predict the other one with a great deal of confidence. There's a correlation of 0.3. Parents' estimates of their teenagers' moods and their teenagers' actual moods are correlated about 0.3. The standard face-to-face unstructured job interview correlated with subsequent managerial ratings of job performance about 0.3. 0.38 is a number that I'll show you later, so a little bit better than 0.3. One of the most useful and definitive surveys of the literature on selection tools that has stood the test of time is Smitten Hunters' 1998 review. They reviewed these different selection methods. We'll talk about them at various points during the discussion today. And I should say explicitly, you should feel free to interrupt me and ask questions at any point. If whatever I say is unclear, if you want to argue with me, if you want to persuade me that you're a great interviewer, even though the data suggests most people can't interview, I'm happy to have that argument. The numbers on these correlations with job performance, where job performance, notably, is measured by supervisor ratings, because there's a great deal of heterogeneity in what performance means in different jobs. The standard way that studies have tried to operationalize that, try to get a handle on measuring what job performance is, supervisor ratings. That comes with imperfections. So you've already talked about this morning, right? The problems generated with trying to match or maximize on some imperfect, subjective, noisy estimate of an outcome that you care about. Supervisor ratings are that imperfect measure, but it is what organizations rely on for making promotion decisions and bonus decisions, and we're not going to do that update. Okay, so unstructured job interviews, 0.38 correlation. When I rag on interviews and complain about their imperfections, my students respond, in the past have responded with skepticism. Like, yeah, I know that the participants in these studies, these interviewers, they couldn't predict job performance, but I know how to interview. And in an attempt to respond to those objections by my students, I started making them interview each other. And I need to jump back to the presentation. So I'm going to show you data from a recent year in the full-time MBA program where I had the students in my class interview each other to predict some consequential future performance. I thought about trying to use job performance. I thought about trying to use grades at Haas, but some of those, there were too, the outcome was too far down the road. Instead, what I settled on was midterm exam performance. So ahead of the midterm, my students interview each other about how they will perform on the midterm exam. The interviewer gets rewarded for accurate predictions. The interviewee gets rewarded for impressing the interviewer. So everybody has grades at stake in this. It's just a small percentage of their grades in the class. But the one being interviewed gets a higher grade if they convince the interviewer that they're going to get a high score on the exam. The interviewer gets rewarded for correctly estimating how the interviewer will actually do on the midterm. You with me? I'm trying to line up the incentives here so that the interviewer wants to get an accurate assessment and the candidate wants to impress the interviewer, much as in real life. So this is how their forecasts break down in terms of deciles. So of course, in reality on the exam, 10% of the test takers fall into each decile. That has to be the case. None of my students forecast that their classmates will be in the bottom 20%, 0. This is not pure, this isn't that the interviewer is being duped by the people who they interview. They predict that less than 10% will fall in the top decile, but there's certainly some bias upward. The mean forecast is 67.8% on the percentile scale, right? On average, of course, it has to be, the median must be the 50th percentile. But these are skewed upward. This doesn't necessarily mean that their forecasts are poorly correlated. This is a feature that most of you have noticed in actual evaluations by supervisors at companies, right? So the red bars indicate me forcing a distribution. I just break it into deciles and tell you, yep, you were in the bottom decile. 10% of the class must be in the bottom 10%. People hate this. My students hate this. Nobody wants to find out they're at the bottom of the distribution. Companies, the standard evaluation system gives supervisors the flexibility to rate their people on the scale, usually like a 7-point scale from failing to meet expectations to spectacularly exceeding expectations, and supervisors avoid using the bottom end of the scale. It's skewed upwards. And when corporations get frustrated with the misuse of the scale, the failure to use the entire range, they'll impose a stacked ranking system. How many here work at companies with stacked ranking systems? There's a forced distribution. Notably, a few companies adopted it. So high-profile companies included GE and Microsoft, among many others. And people hated it. Both the people being rated and the supervisors hated the system. Nobody wants to be rated in the bottom 10%. And so both GE and Microsoft have abandoned their forced stacked ranking system. So then what you get is a distribution that's skewed like this. Now it could still be the case that it's correlated, that my students could tell who's going to do better and who's going to do worse, even though they're all sort of biased upward. This is what the scatter plot looks like with predicted percentile on the X and actual percentile on the exam on the Y. So a perfect correlation. If my students could accurately forecast how their classmates would perform on the exam, all the blue dots would line up perfectly on the diagonal. The green line is the best fit linear regression line. It isn't so great. Now this correlation, that's low. This year is particularly bad. It varies between 0.1 and 0.3. 0.27 was the highest it ever was. Yeah.
So were the interviewers, were they predicting the percentile? Did they said this person will score in the 20th percentile, or what did they say?
Yes, the key question was, what will this person's percentile rank on the exam be? Please.
It's not like I'm interviewing everyone else. I'm only interviewing this person, so I don't have that.
Hold that thought. Some of my students made exams. Correct on the exam. I don't think that solves the problem. It introduces other problems, like how hard is the exam? I don't know. I haven't written it yet. I can't tell you. I could give them, and I do give them all last year's, the exams I've ever given in the class. But it's possible this next year's exam is a little harder or a little easier than prior years. On the other hand, they can actually get information about the distribution of abilities of the other students in the class, and so placement on the percentile scale could arguably be easier, but they don't interview everybody, so hold that thought. Yeah?
Is the, when you grade the interviewees, is it, you said that their performance evaluation is based on how much they can impress the interviewer. Is that in reference to the 67.8 mean score, or is it like on an absolute scale?
It's on the full percentile scale. So the interviewees maximize their performance on this exercise the closer rating they get to 100.
So then, like, all the interviewees did really well.
Well, they could have done better. If they'd all been up here, that would have been much better. Obviously, the interviewers are a little bit suspicious, but not suspicious enough. Yeah.
So this could either mean that the interviewers are their measure of the performance is noisy, or it could be that the grading process is noisy, right? Because both of them are trying to get at some underlying thing, which is aptitude in this area, right? So we can't actually tell where the noise is based on this, right?
Yep, that's a good point. And one partial answer to your question is how valid is my midterm score as a predictor of other things that I care about, like final exam score? The answer to that is it correlates 0.5, 0.6 in the range of job performance one year to the next. So yeah, it's imperfect, it's noisy, but it's roughly in the range of predicting individual differences in performance.
If you're hiring the goal of hiring towards a supervisor's rating, I mean, that might not be the right outcome, but if that's what your goal is.
Yeah, but insofar as my midterm exam is a really lousy measure of the ability that it's trying to assess. So if instead of asking questions about class content, I'd asked Monty Python trivia, or had people shoot hoops to determine their midterm exam score, then I could have gotten a crappy correlation, not because my students are bad at assessing their classmates' ability, but because my measure is so noisy. Yes, my measure is noisy, but it's noisy for reasons that I think make sense. That people are just fundamentally unpredictable in many ways. Are there other hands? Yeah.
I think one concern I have with this experiment comparing with like job interviewing is that, you know, it's been, I don't know, last 10 years I did like hundreds of interviews. Hopefully I get better over time. This is sort of the first time that they interview a student, so they might not know how well they do.
A couple thoughts on that. So a point well taken. My students, almost all of them have participated in recruiting at their jobs prior to coming back to the full-time MBA program. So they do have some experience, possibly not enough. And it is undeniably the case that experience is helpful for improving performance in most things people do. Psychologists have studied how experience improves performance, and one of the most important determinants of the value of experience is punctual feedback. How quickly after you take action or come to a judgment do you figure out what the right answer is, what you should have done? How many were at companies that gave you feedback about how a candidate you interviewed turned out? 1, 2. Most companies don't. And even when they do, how long does it take? When do they give you that feedback? After a year? 2 years?
Yeah, or they also give feedback on the interview.
Say a little bit more about that.
They tell me like, oh, this question was useless. Please don't use it anymore.
How do they know that?
Oh, they know it because the question may have come up too much in other interviews, and so they disqualify that question.
And they know which questions you asked because it was part of a structured interview process where nice, Google? Yeah. So Google is leading the way. They have been bold in implementing some of the best lessons from research. Laszlo Bock in his book Work Rules talks about a lot of this. It's really insightful, interesting, useful stuff. So check it out. And you're going to be at Google, so ask them questions.
Books assigned.
Excellent. So they've been able to determine, for instance, that these mini case questions that many consulting firms are so enamored of, or used to be, somewhat less so now, where they ask you a problem to see how you think. Like, how much does an empty 747 weigh? Or how many rats are there in New York City? And you're supposed to come up with an estimate. That's worthless. It is useful for making the interviewer seem clever, but it's not useful for predicting subsequent job performance. Okay, so, yeah, go ahead. Another question.
Aside from you look at the, like, mentioned cases, I'm a consultant, so I do case interview. And I've heard that a lot, but what I haven't heard is, does a fuller case interview have the same issues or not?
Explain what you mean by a fuller case interview.
Like our cases are where we do 40-minute cases where we give a business problem, our client is a pharma company, driving place X, Y, or Z, and what's the potential, what factors we consider would be potentially struggling and something like all these things. I've heard these many cases are terrible, but we still do. And I think all the other consulting firms still do cases.
I don't know. So the basic answer is I don't know. I could give you the pro and con on that. The pro would be to the extent that this case interview actually parallels the work you're going to be doing if you're hired by that consulting firm. That's a good thing. All interviews are awkward artificial situations, so that's bad. Yeah, I don't have better data, unfortunately. We'll come back to that later. I just wanted to present one more fact about this. So the average absolute error, the distance between my students' predictions, so how the people they interviewed would perform, and their actual performance was on average 29 percentiles off, right? So if I predict that you're going to score in the 50th percentile and you actually score in the 79th percentile, you'd be 29 off. If my students had not conducted the interviews at all and just predicted for all the people they interviewed they would score at the 50th percentile, they would have on average been slightly more accurate. This is an answer to your concern about the percentile ranking as my measure of predicted performance. When my students made that objection, I realized, that what I have to do is get them to interview not just one, but 2 other people. And then we can ask how often they get that ranking right and whether they get the disparity in scores right. So each person interviews 2 other people to predict their midterm exam performance. If they were completely at random guessing who would score higher of the 2, they should on average be right half the time. Right? This is a coin flip. These students were right 51% of the time. Usually that percentage varies between 50 and 60%. So often better than chance, but just barely. And then this is an estimate of the score disparity. So they predict one will score higher than the other. And maybe they predict that disparity is going to be small. Maybe they predict that disparity is going to be large. How is the predicted disparity correlated with the actual disparity? Again, a very weak relationship between those two. So even though they interview 2 people, they're not good at figuring out which one of the 2 will do better on the exam. Yes?
So if I'm in the rank in the 10 or 20th percentile, that means I'm not sure what's going on in class. If I don't know what's going on.
No, that doesn't necessarily follow. So all my students could be excellent.
Okay.
Or it could be, I'm such a great teacher, everybody knows
Right.
what's going on.
The thing is, if I'm on the 10th percentile, I have no idea whether if somebody's actually in the 60th percentile or 90th percentile, or 20th percentile. I have no idea what's going on. If I don't know what's going on, I don't know whether you know what's going on either.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. That's a fairly sophisticated argument. So the idea is that only the best students in class can really appreciate what the subtleties and complexities of the lessons from the class. Only those people will be able to perform well on the exam, and they're not even going to be able to tell if you're in the very bottom and you don't understand what's going on in class. How can you possibly assess whether others understand what's going on in class? So we could ask about the correlation between an individual's exam score and their ability to differentiate between the two people that they interview, for instance. When I have tried to do that analysis, I have not found evidence for the version I just articulated. But it's an interesting idea, which I should go back and test some more. Yeah.
I mean, the fact that some people correctly predicted the testing score could be all random too, because you just got lucky.
Right.
The number and then all of a sudden you just got lucky. Right?
Yeah. We should expect here half the people to get right at random. And it is exactly that concern that makes me reluctant to give full feedback to my students on their performance. Some percentage of my students will correctly predict how their classmates will perform in the midterm, and those people will think, well, I clearly have what it takes in here, and all the rest of you losers don't know how to interview. The numbers, in order to assess that claim, then we would have to do repeated rounds and see, oh, did you get lucky that first time, or do you really have the magic? Oh boy, suddenly my class would be about nothing but interviews and midterms.
Or were they strangers on the interview? Because if you had been in a group with someone and you knew they were that way.
Yeah, you'd think that would push up the correlation between predictions and outcomes among my students. They do know each other. So they've been, this happens 7 weeks into the first semester. So they've been with each other at orientation and then been in various activities. The full-time program allows lots of intense collaboration. They're certainly winding up at parties with these people a lot. And you can say 7 weeks is not nearly enough, but they do have more information about each other outside of the interview than, say, most corporate interviewers would have, right? You're connected to social networks with each other and can ask around. You can find out how much they're enjoying California's liberal recreational marijuana usage laws and whether that might interfere with their midterm exam performance. Yeah?
Is there information that's off limits in the interviews? Can I ask GPA, for example?
You certainly can ask GPA. The rules I give them about content of the interviews is the interviewees can't ask the interviewer what they're going to predict, like how they're going to rate them, and the interviewees can't lie. Those are the only two rules I give them. So in the past, some people have given mini exams that they made up themselves. Sometimes they ask prior GPA, sometimes they ask GMAT. Turns out asking GMAT is a useful question to ask. Yeah, go ahead. Have not done it that way. I don't know how the results would be different. How would you predict?
I think it's closer to being like if someone were trying to impress me, I'd have a better sense of how they will do the exam.
Okay. So you're imagining if we could give the interviewees a truth serum, inject them with something that made them just give the straight up truth without trying to color it or come off sounding smart, that then we would see the correlation go up. If that's the case, then we ought to see a good correlation between people's predictions of their own exam performance and how they actually perform on the exam. I do ask that question, and I attach incentives to it, so that they might be trying to impress me or boast about how they're going to kick butt on the midterm exam, but I put incentives on it and say, you get a better grade in the class. Again, this does not determine whether you get an A or an F, but you get a slightly better grade in the class if you accurately forecast how you're going to perform on the midterm, and it's a private communication only to me. Nobody else sees, and I'm not keeping track of individuals. Here, the forecasts for self are even more optimistic than forecasts for classmates. On average, 72.1 percentile is what they're forecasting for themselves. This is not pure boasting. Again, we see very few people claiming that they're going to be in the top decile. And we see a pretty lousy correlation. So the predicted percentile for self and the actual percentile, in this case, is even more poorly correlated than for interviewees and interviewers. Usually these correlations are pretty similar to each other. This is a bit of an anomaly that the correlation was so much lower for predictions of self. Yeah.
This would suggest that a lot of jobs, they ask people to do self-assessments. And this would say that self-assessments are even worse than peer assessments.
You can count on them being more biased. And I would have very little confidence that the correlation is higher. Why? Well, for some of the same reasons why work in one period and work in the same job by the same person in a subsequent period aren't correlated very highly. Things happen. The next year in the same job, you face different challenges. You're working with different coworkers. You're working on different projects. You get sick. Maybe you get married. Maybe you get divorced. Maybe you have a kid. The world is different in ways that it can be hard to anticipate perfectly beforehand. And all of us have trouble anticipating how we will respond to a novel situation. Psychologists have worked for a very long time to try to identify good measures of personality. How do people differ from one another? And then use those measures to try to predict actual behavior. And there's been a lot of progress. There's strong consensus about the core measures, or core dimensions of personality. So the 5-factor model of personality, the big 5. Most personality psychologists agree that it captures most of the important variability between people in personality. Now, if you take one of those measures from the big 5 assessment of personality, the most reliable, consistent measures of, say, extroversion, and then you go and try to measure behaviors that seem like they're diagnostic of extroversion. How much do they like going to parties? Are they more likely to introduce themselves to strangers in novel settings, like orientation for the MBA program? What you find is pretty mediocre correlations between personalities and behaviors. Those correlations often around 0.3, 0.2, in that range. So behavior is imperfectly predicted by personality differences. In many ways, people are unpredictable. Yes?
It's just like big picture then. So I guess we'll confused. So if people are not able to predict their own performance, I guess how would you expect them to? So is this like just about the measure that you're trying to predict, or is this about the interviewing process, or like is it just a hard thing to predict? How do you do it?
It is hard to predict, but we can do better than unstructured face-to-face job interviews. Yeah. So what does predict? Let's see. I ask my students how confident they are. Their confidence in the accuracy of their predictions is not very well correlated with the actual accuracy in predictions. I wouldn't make too much of the negative correlation. Again, this class here seemed particularly dismal. This is, I study overconfidence. These are measures of their confidence, and what you see is that confidence, so on average they're 48% sure that they'd gotten the right answer, or that their predicted forecast for the interviewee was close to how they were actually going to perform. I think within 5 percentile ranks, their hit rate was substantially lower. So confidence exceeds accuracy across the board. Okay, so what does predict performance? Here, no, this is the column where we're predicting exam score. This is a regression analysis using these predictors. So does my test discriminate on the basis of gender? It doesn't look like it. That doesn't emerge as significant. The interviewee's height, age, These are personality measures of optimism, likability, attractiveness. None of this predicts actual performance on the exam, with the exception of GMAT score. And that's consistent with evidence from the research literature suggesting general mental ability is often a pretty good predictor of job performance. This is a regression predicting the interviewer's rating of the interviewee. Most of them did not ask GMAT, so that turns out to be worthless for predicting how they think the person they interviewed will score on the exam. Instead, how they rate the person as having performed in the interview is the only significant predictor. That's not a shock. That would have to be the case. Okay. So I showed you this list. Let's talk a little bit about some of the items on this list. GMA is general mental ability, intelligence. On the one hand, this shouldn't be ego-threatening to you. You are all extremely intelligent, capable people. On the other hand, nobody likes this answer. You think, that's it? No, that's terrible. I'm not going to just select people based on an IQ test.
Now, can you just specify what, in the Smitten Hunters study, what jobs were they looking at?
Yeah, these are from hundreds of studies. And so you should be rightly concerned, well, maybe this doesn't apply in my industry or for the job type I'm looking at. And maybe that's true, which just raises the challenge of collecting high-quality evidence from your workplace for the jobs that you care about. Most of this evidence comes from really thorough, well-designed studies where they were looking at the entire diversity of applicants, right? If you're Google and you're selecting the top 1% of the people who apply, you've got a real problem because you're only getting a tiny subsection of the diversity of the candidate pool that's going to give you a skewed assessment of how good your predictive tools are. At the extreme, you have the Caltech problem, where if Caltech asks a question, are SAT scores predictive of our students' performance in the class? The answer is no, they appear to be worthless. Why? Well, in many years, Caltech only accepts students with perfect SAT scores. If you have zero variance in your predictor, you cannot measure any correlation with the outcome that you care about. But there is a much more pernicious problem in assessing the quality of your selection tool, even when you've got a more diverse sample that you hire, and that is you can always tell yourself, well, those bozos, if I'm having trouble predicting performance among the core group that I hired, imagine how worse those bozos who I rejected must have been. You'll never have the data. You'll never be able to identify the false negative, the person who you reject for the job who would have been great. Yeah?
What's the difference between work sample test and job tryout?
Is a good question. Work sample tests are, as a rule, more realistic and longer duration. This is like doing the job for a while and then measuring how you do the job in some future period. So job tryouts are shorter periods. Again, it's a decent correlation, but the smaller your sample, the worse it gets. This contrast is one that I want to talk about a bunch between unstructured and structured job interviews. Most of you are familiar with unstructured job interviews, where you as the interviewer have an enormous amount of freedom, flexibility to ask the questions you think are most important, most interesting, most relevant, and you can follow up on interesting things the candidate says, and you can ask questions tailored to each candidate to try to assess their strengths and weaknesses. The problem with that, the Achilles heel of the unstructured interview, is that the situation you put the candidate in is different for each candidate, undermining your ability to compare systematically across the performance of different candidates because they're facing a different situation. It's like, for one candidate, you say, okay, let's go shoot some hoops together. And then, based on how they do, you hire them or not. Another candidate, you go golfing with them and you hire based on their golfing performance. For another one, you give them some creativity task. How could you imagine that these are equally useful for assessing the performance of all candidates? You can't. And so standardizing interviews by structuring them is key to improving their predictive validity. You see in study after study, the correlation goes up. when you structure the interview. Again, it's not perfect. Structured interviews are better, but they're still leaving a lot of the variance unaccounted for. They're shockingly close to work sample tests, which is pretty good. But again, you're not going to have perfect prediction.
What is an integrity test?
Integrity tests are interesting. They wind up high on this list because although they aren't correlated more highly with subsequent job performance, the variance that they do capture is not the same as the variance captured by test of general mental ability. So this is the combined predictive power of whatever this is plus GMA. And integrity tests attempt to assess the moral upstandingness of the candidate by asking them about how they'd behave in particularly morally challenging situations. And because that is a different beast than intelligence tests or interviews, it winds up combining nicely with GMA. What's striking about this, the highest correlation on the screen, is that it is 2 tests that you can administer easily and cheaply without ever having to meet face-to-face with a candidate. And most of you hate that idea, but it should increase the predictive validity of your interviewing and selection process and dramatically reduce its cost. Yeah.
Does that mean that it would be good at any job? So don't seem very specific.
Again, this is averaged across a lot of different jobs, careers, and industries. And if you're concerned that this doesn't generalize to your industry or company or job, then it ought to make you skeptical of this. It should make you want to collect better data. Okay, Ming's going to be coming shortly, so I should... Oh, you're welcome to come in, Ming.
All right.
Come on in. I'm nearing the end. Yeah. This is one of my favorite culture-free tests of intelligence. This is Raven's progressive matrices. The challenge here is to figure out which of these options best completes the pattern. So it's nice because it doesn't discriminate on the basis of culture or language. This is another problem from Ravens. Some of them get really, really hard. I am going to jump over this in the interest of time and just say a few words about structuring interviews. So structured interviews ideally should tap work-relevant predictors of success. The interviewer should evaluate numerically responses to each question. You should only ask questions where the answer is meaningful, where you can specify ex ante before you hear the answer, what a good answer would be like or a bad answer would be like, and then you can evaluate the answer that the candidate gives. Each interviewer should ask each candidate the same questions. Same interviewers should meet with all the candidates. A systematic rating system. Interviewers' ratings should be combined systematically. The simple solution here is you just average across ratings. And the interview performance should be combined with other key predictors, perhaps scoring of their resume or something like that. Yeah?
So if you first sort of do the aptitude and the integrity test, can you weed out, and then does that make the structured interviews by who's left from there like the most accurate sort of combination?
No, it probably renders it substantially lower correlation since, again, Caltech problem, you're restricting the variability in the key predictors that actually do matter. But at that point, if your interview is just chance, it's like flipping a coin, that's fine, if you feel like wasting your time. Why do firms continue to use unstructured interviews despite their weaknesses? Well, they never bother to collect data to test the validity of their interviews. They want to believe they're good judges of character. It helps them tell a story. It can be useful for selling the company to the applicant, and people think they need to assess fit. Well, what is fit? Fit too often is an assessment of how similar you are to us. Do you look like us? Do you sound like us? Do you go to the same schools as we do? Do you like spending your weekends the same way we do? Well, then we'll call you a culture fit. Even if all that stuff is completely irrelevant to actual performance at the company. I'm not going to say fit doesn't matter, but if it matters, figure out what that means. And figure out how to assess it in a hard-to-fake way, in a way that you can test each candidate. So, selection is hard to do well. Understanding what skills make someone successful at the job you're filling is very useful. Figure out how to assess those skills on hard-to-fake tests. And please, please, if you're using interviews, structure them. You can structure your interviews even if the rest of the people at your company think this is a crazy idea. You can identify the questions you think are most relevant, develop a systematic rating system, and use those when you're interviewing job candidates. Okay, I should wrap up there.
Don.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.